Growing up, nothing beat the smell of a hot, salty kitchen on the East Coast. Today, we are exploring 10 vintage maritime comfort foods that kept Atlantic Canadians warm during those brutal nor'easters, from heavy Rappie Pie to creamy Hodge Podge. Please give this video a friendly like and kindly subscribe to our channel. Number 1. Hodge Podge. Let's start with a dish that perfectly celebrates the absolute peak of the short maritime summer garden harvest, the delightfully named Hodge Podge. This is not just a standard vegetable soup, it is an incredibly rich, heavy, milk-based vegetable stew that is deeply beloved across Nova Scotia. The absolute key to a proper Hodge Podge is using only the youngest, freshest, most tender vegetables available right at the beginning of the harvest season. We are talking about tiny new potatoes, string beans, freshly shelled sweet peas, and baby carrots, all gently boiled in a single pot. But the real magic happens when you completely drown those tender vegetables in a massive amount of heavy cream and melting butter. I spent 3 hours researching early Acadian agricultural journals, and what shocked me was discovering how heavily reliant they were on this specific, fleeting midsummer harvest window. The rich, velvety cream binds the starch of the new potatoes together, creating a completely luxurious, intensely comforting bowl of pure summer warmth. Served with a thick slice of buttered bread, it is a completely unpretentious, incredibly satisfying masterpiece of authentic vintage maritime home cooking. Number 2. Rappie Pie. Moving deep into Acadian territory, we have a completely unique, highly polarizing dish that is practically a religion in southwestern Nova Scotia, the legendary Rappie Pie. This is not a standard pastry pie at all, but rather a dense, gelatinous, heavy potato casserole that requires a completely agonizing amount of physical labor to prepare. The traditional process involves grating massive amounts of potatoes and aggressively squeezing out every single drop of their natural liquid using a heavy cotton bag. Once the potatoes are completely bone dry, you desperately rehydrate them by pouring boiling hot chicken or pork broth directly over the dry shreds. This bizarre process completely changes the starch structure, creating a thick, gluey, almost dumpling-like texture. It is then layered with shredded chicken or salt pork and baked until a completely rigid, incredibly crunchy, golden brown crust forms on the absolute top. You either intensely love the heavy, gelatinous texture or you completely hate it. However, it remains a wildly important, historically vital survival food that perfectly showcases the unbelievable ingenuity and absolute endurance of early Acadian families trying to stretch basic, cheap root vegetables for their massive winter meals. Number 3. Salt cod fish cakes. Before modern refrigeration completely changed the way we consume seafood, the entire Atlantic economy practically ran on aggressively salted, dried cod. Salt cod fish cakes were the absolute undisputed champion of cheap, filling, everyday maritime dinners. The preparation required incredible patience because the rock-hard, heavily salted fish had to be soaked in cold water overnight, with the water changed multiple times just to make it barely edible. Frugal homemakers would aggressively flake the softened fish and furiously mix it with massive amounts of cheap leftover mashed potatoes, finely diced onions, and a heavy dash of black pepper. The mixture was formed into thick, round patties and pan-fried in hot bacon fat or pork drippings until a perfectly crispy, incredibly savory crust completely formed on the outside. Served bright and early for a heavy, working-class breakfast, or late at night for a cheap dinner, these salty, dense cakes were completely essential for surviving the freezing coastal winters. Smothered in a heavy spoonful of bright, tangy green tomato chow chow, they remain a profoundly nostalgic, deeply satisfying culinary symbol of the tough, working-class history of the beautiful, windy East Coast shores today. Number 4. Solomon Gundy. If you want to experience a truly pungent, deeply historical flavor that completely defined the historic maritime pantry, you have to look at Solomon Gundy. This aggressively pickled herring dish is a legendary staple in Nova Scotia, directly descended from early European fishing communities. Frugal fishers would take the incredibly oily, highly perishable herring and submerge it in a fiercely acidic, heavily spiced bath of white vinegar, thick slices of raw onion, and pickling spices like whole peppercorns and aromatic bay leaves. After sitting in the cold cellar for weeks, the harsh vinegar completely dissolved the tiny pin bones and effectively essentially cooked the raw fish. I actually visited a small coastal village last year, and tasting a jar of homemade Solomon Gundy absolutely blew my mind. It is wildly salty, intensely sour, and completely unapologetic in its overpowering fishy flavor. Served simply on a dry, plain soda cracker with an extra slice of sharp raw onion on top, it was the ultimate, deeply bracing, midwinter appetizer. It is a bold, challenging, incredibly historical dish that completely captures the rugged, incredibly harsh, salt-sprayed spirit of the wild North Atlantic Ocean perfectly. Number 5. Newfoundland Jigs Dinner. We are traveling out to the rocky shores of Newfoundland to look at the absolute, undisputed king of Sunday gatherings, the legendary Jigs Dinner. This is an incredibly massive, wildly heavy, single-pot boiled meal that is basically an absolute cultural institution. The absolute foundation of the entire dish is heavily salted navel beef, which must be soaked overnight to aggressively draw out the massive amounts of preserving salt. This tough meat is then violently boiled in a giant pot for hours to create a completely rich, salty broth. Next, massive chunks of hearty root vegetables, turnips, carrots, and massive wedges of green cabbage are dropped directly into the boiling meat water, absorbing every single drop of that intensely savory fat. But the absolute crowning glory is the peas pudding, a thick paste of dried yellow split peas tied up in a cotton bag and boiled right inside the exact same pot. The result is a completely exhausting, incredibly filling, intensely salty masterpiece of survival cooking. It leaves you feeling completely warm, undeniably sleepy, and completely connected to generations of tough, resilient Newfoundlanders enduring incredibly harsh, brutally cold winters year after year perfectly. Number 6. Fish and Brewis. If there is one dish that perfectly demonstrates making absolute magic out of the toughest, driest pantry staples imaginable, it is the classic Newfoundland comfort meal known as Fish and Brewis. This deeply historic working-class dish was famously eaten by sailors who had basically nothing but rock-hard ingredients during months-long sea voyages. It relies entirely on two incredibly stubborn components: aggressively dried salt cod and completely rock-hard hardtack biscuits, known locally as hard bread. Both of these completely indestructible ingredients have to be soaked in cold water overnight, just so you don't immediately break your teeth. They are then gently boiled separately, roughly mashed together into a heavy, starch-filled pile, and aggressively mixed. The absolute secret weapon that makes this entire dish completely magical is scrunchions. These are tiny, perfectly diced cubes of heavily salted fatback pork that are aggressively fried down in a pan until they become completely crispy, rendering out all their liquid fat. Pouring those hot, intensely salty, crunchy pork bits and heavy grease directly over the soft, bland fish and bread instantly creates an incredibly savory, completely unforgettable, deeply comforting maritime culinary masterpiece to enjoy today. Number 7. Figgy Duff. You simply cannot properly discuss traditional Atlantic Canadian comfort foods without looking at the wonderfully dense, incredibly heavy dessert known as Figgy Duff. Despite its highly charming, incredibly quirky name, this historic Newfoundland dish actually contains absolutely zero fresh figs. In older Atlantic dialects, the word figgy simply referred to raisins. This is essentially a traditional boiled pudding that was historically cooked completely inside a cotton flour sack. Frugal home cooks would furiously mix together flour, molasses, warm butter, breadcrumbs, and a massive handful of dried raisins to create a thick, heavy batter. The sack was tightly tied and dropped directly into a pot of rapidly boiling water, often the exact same pot used to cook a heavy savory meal like Jigs Dinner. As it furiously boiled, the pudding aggressively expanded, resulting in a completely dense, deeply sweet, highly spiced cake that tasted incredibly strongly of rich, dark molasses. I personally think this is the most underrated historical dessert we have in Canada. Served steaming hot with a massive splash of rich rum sauce, a proper Figgy Duff is the absolute ultimate, deeply warming cure for a freezing winter night. Number 8. Touton. We are keeping our focus on traditional Newfoundland comfort cooking to explore the absolute greatest, incredibly simple breakfast item ever created, the legendary Touton. Long before prepackaged cereals and fancy toaster pastries completely dominated morning routines, mothers would save a small portion of their leftover actively rising bread dough from the previous day's massive baking session. Instead of baking it in an oven, they would aggressively stretch the raw yeasty dough into flat, rustic little discs and drop them directly into a hot cast iron skillet, completely filled with bubbling rendered pork fat or butter. The dough violently fries up, and creating an unbelievably perfect texture that is completely golden and aggressively crunchy on the absolute outside, while remaining incredibly soft, warm, and wonderfully chewy on the exact inside. To properly experience a hot, fresh Touton, you must aggressively smother it in a massive dripping pool of dark, sticky molasses or incredibly sweet, pure maple syrup. The sharp contrast between the completely savory, salty pork fat fried crust and the deeply intense dark sweetness of the sticky molasses is an absolutely perfect, highly nostalgic culinary experience that completely defines an East Coast morning perfectly. Number 9. Digby Chicks. If you wander into the coastal towns of Nova Scotia, you might hear older generations warmly talking about a deeply historical, heavily smoked treat known as Digby Chicks. Despite the incredibly deceptive name, there is absolutely zero poultry involved in this traditional dish. A Digby chick is actually a heavily cold-smoked, intensely salted whole herring, completely named after the bustling fishing town of Digby. Before modern, massive commercial fishing completely changed the local economy, smoking herring was a completely vital preservation method that allowed families to store cheap, oily fish throughout the brutally dark winters. The smoking process over smoldering hardwood fires gave the fish a completely unmistakable, aggressively strong, deeply pungent aroma and an incredibly tough, almost leathery texture. They were so intensely salty and strongly flavored that they were basically completely inedible, unless you first completely skinned them and painstakingly picked out the countless tiny bones. Often eaten simply with a dry slice of heavily buttered bread, these heavily smoked little fish were the absolute ultimate, fiercely potent, working-class protein source that perfectly represents the rugged, unforgiving historical reality of the massive Atlantic coastal fishing industry even today. Number 10. PEI Aadian Meat Pie. We are finishing our journey across the East Coast by stopping in Prince Edward Island to look at the deeply beloved, completely glorious PEI Aadian Meat Pie. While Quebec has its legendary tourtière, the Acadian variation found on the island is a completely different, remarkably distinct culinary experience. The absolute defining characteristic of this savory, heavy pie is the incredibly complex, highly specific blending of different meats. Usually a massive mix of slow-cooked pork, beef, and occasionally fresh wild game. But what truly sets it completely apart from any other meat pie in the entire country is the aggressive, heavy use of summer savory. This distinct, highly peppery herb grows completely wild across the Maritimes, and Acadians use it in massive, generous handfuls. The rich, slow-simmered meat mixture is perfectly packed into a deeply rich, incredibly thick, flaky double pastry crust and heavily baked until golden brown. The smell of hot pastry and deeply intense summer savory completely fills the kitchen, instantly signaling a massive family celebration. It is a completely beautiful, intensely flavorful, deeply historical pie that beautifully honors the incredible culinary endurance of the remarkable Acadian people forever. These 10 incredible vintage maritime recipes perfectly capture the deeply resilient, completely comforting spirit of the Canadian East Coast. From salty fish cakes to sweet figgy duff, they prove that the toughest ingredients make the best meals. Which of these historic Atlantic dishes is your favorite? Let me know in the comments below and please subscribe.